Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Touchdown Tuesdays, the official football podcast of Brew Sports. I'm Ian DeMars alongside Ryan Solomon. Ryan, how's it going today?
Whereas last week we were happy, this week we are depressed because the Bucks are currently tied with the Raptors 2-2 now after 2 games in Toronto.
Yep, it is kind of been a different week for us. Yeah, we were very excited last week. Had a lot to talk about, not just regarding a little bit of basketball, but regarding the whole football world. We're a little down because of the Bucks, but we still got lots of football to talk about this week.
Yeah, that's for sure. And there's a lot of stuff that's happening in the offseason. A lot of people getting in trouble, getting re-signed, players going to different teams. There's still a lot going on, even though it's not during the draft anymore or during the actual season.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's all. That's just much of what we're going to get into this week. But to start the show, we're going to talk about this past week's question of the week. Now, Ryan and I discussed this a little bit last week towards the end of the show, and it was regarding the NBA draft lottery that happened last week. So the question of the week was, do you think this is something that the NFL should put into their rules for upcoming drafts? And it was basically a yes or no answer. Ryan and I had different opinions on this. I was more on the yes train, saying this could possibly happen and would be interesting. Ryan was more on the no side. And Facebook and Twitter do agree with you, Ryan. It's pretty similar percentage-wise. 65 on Facebook, 60 on Twitter say that there should not be an NFL draft lottery similar to what the NBA does. Now, I know we touched a little bit on this last week. So you want to give me your main point again on why this shouldn't happen in the NFL?
Yeah, so one of the reasons that I had was that it's different than the NBA because one player doesn't often make your franchise into a sudden championship contender. You do see it rarely, but even in that case, it usually takes a little bit of time before they suddenly become a team that's on the radar. So you usually don't have a lot of teams that are in this complete tank fest. There's fewer games, so the team wants to get as much revenue as they can out of each game, so they're not going to rest their starters or anything like that. It's just a different situation with the fewer games and the fact that there's more players that play a role in the team's success than in the NBA.
Yeah, just looking at it, I think it's more you can kind of see in the NBA how easy it is to kind of tank. It's kind of difficult to see that in the NFL. And in baseball, it kind of does happen too. But I think that's part of the game in baseball is trying to start to rebuild at certain points. In the NFL, it's kind of hard to do that because one year you look to possibly try to rebuild. Then the next year, while you're thinking you're still in the rebuilding phase, you do a lot better. So I guess at this point, it's kind of hard in the NFL. It's just a matter of if we start seeing multiple seasons where teams go 0-16 or 1-15 somewhere. If we see a streak of consecutive 3 or 4 seasons where that happened, I think that's where the conversation could start, and that's why I could see this possibly coming into play within the next 5 years. That'll be something we'll have to just keep an eye out for. But the NBA draft lottery this year was very exciting based off the changes they made. But I do want to give a shout out to Nick Sherman from Elkhorn, Wisconsin. He had commented on the question saying that the teams that don't make the playoffs, he said that if they were to institute some sort of draft process change, that they should have I think he said the 8 worst teams playing in a tournament, and based off of that, the team that wins the tournament gets the number 1 pick, and then descending order for the rest of the tournament, and then the other teams that aren't in the tournament would just go based off of their record. What are your thoughts on that possibility happening? That one, I'm not sure would happen, but it's kind of a unique twist.
Yeah, I mean, that would be interesting. I had thought about last week giving the top pick to, like, instead of the worst team, giving it to, like, the 8 seed in one of the conferences, like the 8 seed with the lowest record. But no matter what you do in terms of a high draft pick in a sport where there's only 5 starters, you're going to have people trying to jockey for position in a negative way, because then you would start to see teams that are in the 6 or the 7 spot tank and go down to 8 or something of that nature. And if you kind of have the teams that are worst play off, and then all of a sudden one team does well, they might have been one of the better teams in the league who just wanted to tank to get into this thing, because then they would tank to get into the tournament and then they could play much better. So I don't think there's a perfect system out there.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to look at what could be the best solution. I mean, we're still seeing in the NFL in regards to just all their rules where they try testing certain stuff for 1 or 2 years, and then suddenly a couple years later it changes and it changes and it changes. So it gets to this point where I don't think we're ever going to have the exact answer on what is going to be the perfect fit for what needs to be done for the NFL draft. But sticking on topic, if you had to pick the team that's going to get the 1 pick next year, who do you think that'll be as of right now?
The 1 pick in the NFL we're talking?
Yeah, the number 1 pick next year in 2020. Who do you think
I think it'll be the Cardinals again.
All right. And why are you leaning towards the Cardinals?
Because the Cardinals have too many holes that they still didn't fill. Sure, they got their guy in Kyler Murray, but there's no guarantee that he's going to propel that team to any sort of winning season this year. And behind that shoddy offensive line with a rookie quarterback, rookie head coach, I just don't see them turning it around this year.
Yeah, I can definitely see where you're coming from at this point. I do think that they would be one of the teams that could slip. The Dolphins has been a team that's been talked about, or any other team besides the Patriots in that division. If I had to give one team that might get some consideration that I don't think is being talked about, actually I'll give 2. I think the Tampa Bay Buccaneers could be, because they're kind of in a weird situation with Jameis Winston. But I kind of think that the Redskins could possibly fall in that void. Yeah, they have a rookie quarterback, but we really don't know what's going to happen regarding him. Remember, he basically only started 1 full season at Ohio State, and they get a lot of injuries every year. So I think inexperience on that team could possibly hurt them this year.
Yeah, that's very true. And you also have to take into account there could be a team out there that loses their starting quarterback like week 2 and suddenly has a horrible season. So it's really difficult to predict. There's teams you can always sort of suspect are going to be in the contention for the worst record in the NFL, but there's usually 1 or 2 surprises that happen.
Yeah, absolutely right there, Bob. We got a lot of time before that. We'll actually know what will happen in those cases. But let's move on to some signings that happened this past week in the NFL. So we saw the Baltimore Ravens, after losing quite a few players at the beginning of free agency, did sign a couple of key ones this past week. They signed a couple of former first-round picks, Michael Floyd, wide receiver, and then Shane Ray, the defensive end. We also saw the Patriots. They are reunited with Jamie Collins after he had previously played with the Cleveland Browns. And then we saw an interesting signing yesterday where the Tampa Bay Buccaneers brought in defensive tackle Ndamukong Suh on a 1-year deal. So of all those signings, which one do you think makes the most sense?
Yeah, so I think that there's 2 here to look at that make a lot of sense. Shane Ray for the Ravens and Jamie Collins with the Patriots. And I'll kind of touch on each one of these. Michael Floyd could potentially be a good signing. He had some good years in Arizona, basically until he was released after that DUI in 2016, in which case he's kind of bounced around the NFL, never really found a for sure home with any team. And then the Buccaneers signing Ndamukong Suh is basically a whole replacement for the fact that they let go of Gerald McCoy. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second, but this is basically trying to plug in to find a spot for the now vacant hole that's in the defensive line. I like Jamie Collins with the Patriots because he's one of those classic players that performed very well with the Patriots. He was a 2nd-round pick, and then once he went to a different team, had 2 of the worst seasons that he's had in his career. So it's not surprising that they're bringing him back to try to plug him in now to that team and sort of reunite him with the squad that he did so well with. I picture him doing well again in New England. And then Shane Ray is brought in to replace the immense amount of talent that was lost on the Ravens defensive side of the ball in Terrell Suggs, C.J. Mosley, and Zadarius Smith. So they needed someone to come in and play at a high level because that team won the AFC North last year, and they're going to try to return to that status, but they're going to have to do without some of these key players. So bringing in Ray was almost a necessity from my point of view.
Yeah, and definitely I think all these players make sense for what teams needed to fill out. I'm going to go with the Buccaneers on this one. I think Ndamukong Suh is kind of a guy that they need in this kind of situation. because this is going to be a weird season for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers because you got a new head coach in Bruce Arians, you got Jameis Winston who's playing basically in the last year of his rookie deal. Their running back situation's kind of a mess. Their whole team's kind of a mess. And you look at, we talked about a couple weeks ago, Jason Pierre-Paul possibly missing the whole season. So they need to get some pressure on the quarterback up front. We're going to be talking about Gerald McCoy in a little bit, but Ndamukong Suh is a guy that can put some pressure on the quarterback. Now, he might not necessarily get a lot of sacks, but if he can pressure the quarterback and at least cause him to throw the ball bad or get someone else to get a sack, then you're doing your job, and that's something that Ndamukong Suh can do very well. He's had a past history of being known as a dirty player, but it hasn't really been an issue for him these last couple of years when he was towards the end of his career with the Dolphins, and then last year when he was on the Los Angeles Rams. I think this is a good fit, and it's a good deal. It's only a one-year deal, so this could be a deal. This could be the year where he shows that he still has something, or maybe it's a sign that he could be on the decline. And he's going to Florida, so he won't have to pay any state taxes. So it's kind of a smart move by both, not just the Buccaneers, but Ndamukong Suh also.
It's always good to not have to pay any state taxes. The reason why I didn't pick Ndamukong Suh as being super important among these players is that I think it's really inconsequential what the Buccaneers do this season because I don't think they have a chance to go anywhere. If you look at their division, there's three other teams that are clearly better than them, and the Saints probably are the favorite to win this or get to the Super Bowl this year from the NFC. So I think that they're probably looking at a last place finish in their division, if not their entire conference. And bringing in Ndamukong Suh, well, it helps a little bit, and it makes up for the fact that they are now missing two players that were expected to be on the defensive side of the ball. It's not going to propel them to any sort of status in the NFC South this year. So that's why I didn't find that one to be super relevant and instead went with some teams that could potentially make some noise in the playoffs.
Yeah, and Ndamukong Suh, it's just a weird situation for the place he's going to because, like I said, it doesn't seem like they're going to be in a good spot this year just because there's so many question marks regarding that team. The one guy we didn't really mention was Michael Floyd, and I think the reason why he's not the one we're talking about is just because he's been on such a decline since he had a great start to his career with the Arizona Cardinals. Remember, you did mention the DUI arrest that caused him to get released by the Cardinals. He's filled in a couple of teams in the NFL over the last couple of years, but he hasn't really gone back to that form where he was with the Cardinals. So this maybe could be the start that he needs playing with a younger quarterback in Lamar Jackson. So it'll be interesting to see how that one plays out. Well, let's talk about Gerald McCoy a little bit. So he and the Buccaneers, they mutually agreed to part ways, so he is no longer a part of that team. It still seems like he has plenty of years still left in the NFL to be a productive defensive lineman. So where do you think he might end up signing?
Yep, that's a good question. And before we get into where, the first thing is the why, and it's basically because the Buccaneers didn't want to fork over the money that he was asking for, which I think was around $14 million. And they instead went with Suh, who was a slightly cheaper option. I think they got him for $10 million. But one of the spots that I'm looking at for McCoy to go is the Indianapolis Colts. The Colts have an estimated $58 million in cap space right now, and their best interior defensive lineman is not anybody that you've ever heard of. So they could use somebody to kind of create push in that defensive line. And I think that Gerald McCoy would be a perfect fit right now, considering he's the best free agent available at that spot.
Yeah, and the Colts, you could definitely tell that they're looking for that guy in the middle. So that could definitely be a solid landing spot for him going forward. I do the point you made about them wanting to save money. When you look at the fact that they're trying to save money, part of me is thinking that they're leaning towards re-signing Jameis Winston, which could be a scary thought based off some of the off-the-field issues he's had and inconsistent play. So I'm sure we're going to be talking about that over the next month or so as we start getting into training camp. But how about the Los Angeles Rams? I mean, they no longer have Ndamukong Suh, so why not plug in a guy like Gerald McCoy? They could easily fork over a solid one-year contract to him or pick up the rest of his contract with the Buccaneers. So I think that they could possibly plug him in where Ndamukong Suh did. Ndamukong Suh last year although he did play somewhat good, I would still consider it a down year for him last year. So I think if they were to go after him, I think that upgrades that defense a little bit, and that Los Angeles Rams team maybe gets that one piece that they needed in the Super Bowl last year.
It's possible. I know that they didn't retain Ndamukong Suh partly because there was a contract issue or a potential contract issue. So I don't know how much money they'd be willing to pay Joe McCoy coming in, but adding him as a piece to that defense could help them try to get back to the Super Bowl. But we'll have to see how it plays out because I still think they're going to have a little Super Bowl hangover. But there are a couple other teams that have been mentioned too, looking at McCoy, possibly the Patriots have been listed, the 49ers, the Browns. A lot of teams that are typically active in free agency are also possibly eyeing up this guy to bring him in to bolster their defenses.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see where McCoy ends up. I don't suspect him being on the market for too long. I mean, we could possibly see him get signed to a team maybe by the end of May. So maybe in the next week and a half, he could be on a new team, and that's definitely something we will be looking forward to seeing where he will end up next. We did have a player get a contract extension this past week as well. Patriots wide receiver Julian Edelman received a 2-year contract extension, staying with the Patriots, kind of the older guy there now on the team. How much of a factor do you think he will still be for them going forward with this extension?
I think he'll be a big factor for them, and he's been Tom Brady's security blanket over the past few seasons. He's the one guy that he can always rely on to come through. He's a great route runner. I mean, he was the MVP of the Super Bowl. He had 10 receptions for 141 yards. And so he's the guy that Brady always looks for. And I think this is kind of a show of good faith to Tom Brady to say, hey, look, we know that you don't have as many weapons as you used to, but we'll still give you Julian Edelman. And we're counting on you to still be that productive Tom Brady who's winning Super Bowls for the next couple of seasons at least. I think if they were planning on going in a different direction, they could ship off Edelman, get some draft picks back for him, and then try to go with a younger receiving core to kind of change the guard in New England, but they decided to go with signing the veteran 32-year-old.
Yeah, and the extension made sense because with him being towards the end of his contract, you add on a couple more years, this basically secures Julian Edelman playing until Tom Brady's done playing, assuming that he does end up
You
retiring.
assume it does, but how do we really know for sure?
Yeah, I mean, we never know. I mean, next year he could say that he could play till 50, but that's something I'm assuming we'll find out after this next year, assuming he puts up another stellar season. But it's a good extension sign because this team needs some veteran depth at wide receiver or just in the passing game in general. Remember, Rob Gronkowski retired. They did just draft a couple of younger guys in the NFL draft. So they need one of those veteran leaders to be on the team, kind of mentor these younger players over the next couple of years. And Edelman's definitely a guy who can help do that. He's been a big part of the team, as you mentioned, was the Super Bowl MVP. Remember, this guy was a college quarterback. So whenever we don't see it too often from Bill Belichick, but when we do see some trickery from him, it's usually involving Julian Edelman. So that's another reason why you extend him, because whenever you're in a game where you need a trick play, Edelman's going to be the guy that delivers it. So it's a good move for them. He's going to be around for the next couple of years, and assumingly it'll be until Tom Brady retires, if he retires at the age of 45, like he said he might end up doing.
I'm still thinking that 50 is more likely at this point in time.
Yeah, a 50 could be pushing him. I mean, look at Brett Favre, for example. It seemed like that guy could be playing until his upper 50s, but then we saw injuries started to derail his career. So it'll be interesting to see if TB12 will end up having injuries throughout his career over the next couple of years. But that's something that we won't really find out until training camp starts over the next couple of months. But we did have some players get suspended over the past week, though. All-pro cornerback for the Arizona Cardinals, Patrick Peterson, received a 6-game suspension. An offensive lineman for the Cincinnati Bengals, Alex Redmond, got suspended 4 games for PEDs. Which suspension is going to play a bigger factor into the upcoming season for the Cardinals or the Bengals?
Really, I don't think either is going to play a big role in how the season plays out because neither of the teams are really in playoff contention in my mind, especially the Cardinals. So losing Patrick Peterson obviously is a big deal for them because he's one of the best players that they have. Granted, he's been disgruntled in Arizona lately with the direction of the franchise, was talking about potentially being traded and now suspended 6 games. Is going to hurt that defense. If you go to the other guy, Alex Redmond, with the Bengals, they have some other players that can potentially fill his shoes. He was the starter at the end of last season, but he was playing through some injuries. He had a torn labrum and he had a persistent hamstring injury. And the Bengals brought in former Buffalo starter John Miller and then drafted Michael Jordan to sort of try to fix that offensive line to some degree. So he's only suspended 4 games, and they have players that can fill in for him while he's gone. And it's still questionable how impactful Redmond would be when he comes back. So I'm going to say Patrick Peterson is the bigger loss for his team, but in the long run, neither of these is going to have a major impact on what happens this season.
Looking at both the teams, you do make some very solid points on. It's kind of hard to say which one's going to be affected because both these teams kind of don't seem like it's going to affect them too much because of how they're based right now. You look at the Cardinals, obviously they had the worst record last year. Patrick Peterson, I talked about wanting to be traded out of Arizona. Then he talks about how he wants to be back, and now this whole suspension. So that's kind of an issue because he's one of the big veterans on the team. So he's going to be missing a good chunk of the season where he could be a leader for that team. So that's obviously going to hurt him. I'm going to say that's going to be Redmond for the Cincinnati Bengals because they have a new coach. He's an offensive-minded coach, and you lose a key part of your offensive line. Now, as you mentioned, they did draft a couple of guys, and he's only missing 4 games, but that's a quarter of the season. That's a time where he can help develop those younger guys early on in the season. You insert him back in week 5 or 6, depending on where the schedule lies, and they might be in a spot where they're 1-3, struggling right off the gates because they have some of these younger linemen that don't really know the full experience of the game, where Redmond could teach them that by obviously playing it those first 4 games. And it's kind of early to tell whether one of these younger guys can maybe surpass him as a starter, but I think that missing him for the first quarter of the season is going to play a factor into how the couple of guys they drafted develop over the next couple of years for the team.
Yeah, that's a good point that you raise. Both of these franchises are kind of going in the rebuilding direction too. So I think the fact that these guys are out could play a major role in where they end up or if they are returning to the team. So if they play well, if the Cardinals play well without Patrick Peterson, they could maybe look to move him, and the same with Alex Redmond. So I think that these suspensions are more important for the particular players than they are for the team that they're on.
Yeah, and we already saw that Patrick Peterson's not going to be appealing his suspension. It doesn't appear that Redmond will be as well. So it's going to be a key portion of the season that they're going to be missing. So we'll have to wait and see how those teams end up playing out. Obviously, we'll get to see them in training camp and obviously preseason. But once the season starts, they definitely will be missed for both their teams. But speaking of some players that have had some issues but have yet to get suspended for we've had a couple of interesting cases happen with some big-time running backs in the NFL this past week. So we saw Ezekiel Elliott was detained at a festival for pushing a person. He was handcuffed. He wasn't arrested, was just detained. And then we saw Leonard Fournette. He had to pay fines of over $300 this week for speeding, and then he also had some improper tinting in his car. So both these players have had some issues on and off the field before. Of these 2 players, which team should be worried the most?
I think the Cowboys should be worried the most. And part of the reason for this is how kind of benign the Leonard Fournette thing is with the Jaguars. He was pulled over originally for going 65 and a 45. I think that all of us have probably done that at one point or another. It wasn't like somebody going 70 and a 25 or something like that. And then there was the illegal tinting on the windows. Those charges were actually dropped, and he was actually fined $303 for driving with a suspended license from an earlier traffic violation that he never paid. And so Doug Marrone was asked about this, and he basically said, yeah, not to belittle the fact that he broke a law, but I don't really care about this. It's not going to change anything. Ezekiel Elliott, on the other hand, probably won't get any sort of charges for this, but he is constantly doing dumb things and putting himself in situations that aren't good. I remember a couple of years ago, or maybe it was even 1 year ago, he was shown in a clip pulling down a girl's top at like a party or a big get-together or something, and he's just doing stuff like this constantly. It seems like he has not grown up at all. And if I'm the Cowboys, I'm wondering if it's only a matter of time before he does do something that's going to get him suspended or arrested or worse.
Yeah, I can agree to the point where obviously the bigger issue as of which storyline was bigger has to be Elliott with him shoving someone at a festival. I do agree with that. And I'm assuming that there's going to be some sort of punishment from the team, maybe some sort of fine. We really don't know. Leonard Fournette, even though his was less severe of what happened, I think that he's the more worrisome player for their team. I think the Jaguars need to be worried about it. He's had some issues on and off the field over the last couple of years, whether that's traffic issues, whether that's shoving players, starting fights in games. He's had some more issues recently, and it doesn't help that he also isn't a consistent, healthy factor for his team as well. So we see this sometimes in professional sports where players are injured, so they don't go to some of the team activities, or they're kind of more careless than they would be if they were more focused on the season. So we see some players do some dumb, idiotic stuff, like speeding or whatever. And even though it's not a big troublesome thing to worry about if you're Fournette and the Jaguars, I think that you keep having some of these smaller issues, then one day it's going to become a huge issue, and then they're going to really have to worry about this. Remember, they're in a position right now where they really don't know what's going to happen with Fournette going forward because of these recent issues. We did see, as I mentioned, he's had some injury history. They've traded for some big-time backs before. So I'm really curious to see how Fournette's going to mature, because I feel like he's been showing as much as Ezekiel Elliott's had some bigger issues over the type of things that's been happening, we're seeing a lot more smaller things from Leonard Fournette. And I think one of these days, this small thing is going to become a huge thing, and it's going to end up hurting not only the Jaguars, but Leonard Fournette.
You know what would help Leonard Fournette get back together with everything that he did, back when he was actually being productive, would be if the Jaguars had a winning season. Because we saw almost everybody on that Jaguars team just fall apart last year. And Leonard Fournette is no exception. And he was probably one of the people leading the charge of making that team's demeanor even worse. And I think if they get off to a hot start, you're going to see everything perfectly fine in Jacksonville. And with the Cowboys, we kind of saw that last season where everything was gloom and doom, and all of a sudden they started winning, and then everything was great again. I mean, they were talking about firing Jason Garrett at some point during the season. They were talking about Dak Prescott was the right fit for the team, and then they made the playoffs, and all of a sudden it was like, oh yeah, we're all good. So I think that that's probably what's going to happen if the Jaguars succeed. Otherwise, if they have a couple more losing seasons, I could see this guy becoming a potential issue, because he was kind of sulking, because he was turning on the team last year. But I think winning fixes a lot of things, and I expect them to be doing a lot of winning this year.
Yeah, you do make a point how it seems like some of the character issues with certain players happens more on when they're losing when they are winning. So it's going to be interesting to see if some of these players can learn to balance that out, or if they're just going to continue trending down. But we still have a couple months left until training camp, so we can just wait and see if more issues do happen before that starts. But we did see a couple of interesting news related topics in the NFL happen. And the main one we're going to be talking about is that the NFL is asking their teams to stop running the Oklahoma drill in practices. Now, for those of you who don't know what the Oklahoma drill is, I've done it numerous times, especially in college. But it's basically where you have an offense, it doesn't have to be, but simply offensive lineman and defensive lineman going basically head-to-head, start in the three-point stance right away. There's a back behind the offensive lineman. Basically, those two guys are going at it, and the offensive line is trying to make sure that the running back's able to plow through and find a hole. So the reason why the NFL is wanting to go away from this is because of the whole concussion issues. There's been an increase of concussion-related injuries due to this specific drill. What are your thoughts on this, and do you think it's a good move by the NFL to do this?
I don't really have a whole lot of thoughts on it because this kind of fits in with what the NFL has been doing lately, trying to eliminate concussions, trying to eliminate helmet-to-helmet contact. And I mean, there's no reason really to have helmet-to-helmet contact during practice if it can be avoided. And I don't really know if you could probably speak to this better than me, if this drill was beneficial for you as a lineman, if you thought you got a lot out of it, or if there's other ways to do this that could be even better. But I mean, I think it just goes along with the narrative of the NFL that they're trying to find a way to make an unsafe sport more safe, and they're just looking at all aspects from practice to game to after to try to neutralize any sort of negative impact on the body.
Yeah, I will definitely touch base, and I've done this drill before numerous times, and it's a lot different doing this drill than doing what the purpose of the drill is in the game. When you do this drill, you're basically almost head-to-head with the defender already. In an NFL game, you won't necessarily see that happen unless it's like a goal line stand situation. And you could say that's the purpose of this drill, but obviously I think the more purpose of this drill is obviously the offense, get your blocking down for the running back. Defense, obviously you practice some of your moves to get by the offensive line. I'm kind of mixed on it because it is an exciting drill, and it definitely is one that all the players get hyped up about at times during practice. But it is kind of a dangerous drill. I've seen multiple players on my teams in the past get injured on this types of drills. It's not always head injuries, though. There are other injuries that can happen regarding this, but when you're that close head-to-head, it can be an issue. So if you're looking to prevent more concussions, then it's the right move to do this. I mean, obviously, it's a drill that is one of the most common drills that we see in all of football, not just the NFL, high school level, college level, even in Pop Warner. But I mean, it's unfortunate that this drill is going away because I do think that this is a drill that, at least in the NFL, I think it's more beneficial. But I don't know what's really going to happen regarding this. It'll be interesting to see how the concussion rates over the offseason go, and seeing if it goes up or if it goes down. Because if it drops significantly, then this might be the right decision. But if it's staying where it's at, then I'm not even sure if it was.
I don't feel like we hear a lot about concussions occurring during practice. And it could be that just no one thinks to look for them, or maybe they don't report them, but I would think they would have to report them. I just don't recall hearing a lot of this person's out for the rest of the week or this person out for the game because of a practice concussion.
Yeah, and it's more basically for just the off-season team activities. Obviously, when you get to the season, they get reported a lot more. But during the off-season, they get reported, but it's not like breaking news on sports and anything. Typically, this is something you would just find on like your local team sports website or whatever. So typically, it's not anything that gets like said out loud. It's more just like it's said, but it's more like under wraps for like the locals. So it's definitely interesting that they do it that way. I just feel like everything should be reported like it would be if it was the regular season. But I guess that's how different it is between in-season and off-season for the NFL. And Ryan, I know we have talked about this other thing that that they're kind of looking at still. I know we didn't really talk about it too much recently, but there's still some questions regarding replay review and pass interference. And I was thinking about it before the show, and I wanted to bring it up because it's kind of at that point where is it even worth doing replay review for pass interference?
I still think no. I still think that doing pass interference replays is opening up a Pandora's box because there could be potential pass interference on almost every play. And now we're going to be looking hard on every single play that could potentially be pass interference. And I think it's going to be hard to draw the line on what actually is and what isn't, because the letter of the law is going to be different than the optics of it, which is going to be different than what the fan bases and the coaches think about it. So I think it's one of those things that just shouldn't be reviewable, and there's going to be some bad calls that happen. I mean, we saw one with the Saints and the Rams. We saw one that wasn't pass interference based, but the Hail Mary with the Packers. Throughout history, we've seen bad calls in games, and it just is the way that it is. Sometimes it goes for your team, sometimes it doesn't go for your team. And I think nitpicking every single detail of a pass interference call is going to inevitably be a bad thing for the NFL.
You and I are in agreement on this, Ryan. We've been in agreement on this since the whole possibility of replay review being involved with pass interference has become a thing. And I think that when they do test this for the year, I think that this could be the only year they do it, because there's going to be some sort of flaws. There's going to be hard to make concrete evidence on what exactly institutes pass interference. There's multiple different angles you could look at it that could constitute pass interference. And I think that's going to be an issue that we're going to be seeing in games this year, of how some teams are going to say this is why it's pass interference, and how the referees reviewing it are going to determine why it is or isn't pass interference. And I think because of the fact that we're still having issues after they had agreed to look at it is going to be a factor as to why it's not going to stick around.
And think about some of the pass interference calls, how close they are too. And what about ones that are sort of like mutual pass interference? Like if you have one where you challenge it and you want offensive pass interference, and they look at it and they decide it's actually defensive pass interference, is that a thing that can happen? There's just so many different variables that can go on here. And we've seen plays where it's like two guys are pushing each other. What do they call in that situation if it gets reviewed?
Yeah, it's very tough, and this is going to be an issue when it gets to the season. And I'm really curious to see how not just the players and coaches, but how the fans are going to react to it, because we're both already saying that it's not going to work. And I think that by the time the season starts, everyone's going to realize that it wasn't the best decision. But let's move on to some good news that happened in the NFL. And it seems like that the Minnesota Vikings and Kyle Rudolph, instead of seeming like they're going to inch apart upcoming next year, seems like they're about to come back together. And it looks like that Kyle Rudolph's going to be very close to signing an extension with the Minnesota Vikings. It's kind of an interesting move since they did draft a tight end in this past year's draft. Do you think this is a good move for the Vikings to extend Kyle Rudolph?
I think it is a good move. He's one of the leaders in their locker room, and he's been on the Vikings forever and being productive forever. And like you said, they did draft Irv Smith Jr. from Alabama in the second round, but you don't really know how that sort of prospect is going to turn out. So you might as well keep Kyle Rudolph around for a little bit longer. And at worst case scenario, he can try to pass on some of his wisdom and what he's learned as an NFL tight end to Irv Smith. And, you can kind of be the generation gap sort of player that's going to be there until he's ready to retire, or maybe he wants to move to another team, and then Irv Smith will be waiting in the wings to take his spot there. So at least you're sort of bridging it instead of just getting rid of Kyle Rudolph, assuming that Irv Smith Jr. is your answer, and then just rolling with it. Because the fans in Minnesota love Kyle Rudolph. The team loves Kyle Rudolph. You don't want to see that kind of guy leave.
Yeah, and he does bring that veteran leadership to the team, which I definitely think is something that they need to keep. And it's a good move if the deal does end up getting signed for an extension for Kyle Rudolph and the Vikings. I think pairing him with Irv Smith Jr. makes it a power and speed combo. Smith Jr. being the more speedy type of tight end. Well, Kyle Rudolph, he's more of the power guy. He can make some very good blocks, and then he can bulldoze through guys on big catch plays. So I do think that could be a combo that they could look to develop over the next couple of years. And then when it does get to that time where Kyle Rudolph could maybe end up retiring or maybe moves on, then Irv Smith's going to definitely learn enough from Rudolph to become that number one tight end for that team, and then maybe learn some valuable lessons from Kyle Rudolph. So I definitely do think it is a good move. Now, I believe from what I saw, the reported extension, I thought I saw 5 years, but that seems like a very long extension. Uh, how long do you think we end up seeing him sing with the Vikings for?
I mean, I think 2 years, 2 or 3 years seems pretty good because he is getting up there in age. But tight ends, again, don't necessarily need to be super young. We saw Jason Witten have success when he was older and now he's coming back. We saw Tony Gonzalez have success when he was older. Antonio Gates is still around. Tight end is a position where you don't have to be super young and athletic anymore to play it successfully. So you could see him be around a while as long as he is productive. I think 5 years is a little bit long. I would go 2 years or 3 years, and then if things are still good at the end of that time, then you can maybe go for like a 1 year deal after or something like that.
Yeah, I definitely think that 2 to 3 year gap is the right gap for him. I could easily see it being the 3 year gap just because it gives him a couple of years or more time to develop Irv Smith. And I think that Irv Smith's going to need that time to develop into a solid tight end in the NFL. Well, let's switch gears a little bit. Let's look into the XFL now. Now, last week we had talked about how they did hire their eighth coach for their final team in June Jones. Now, we obviously don't know the aspects of the teams there. We don't know any of the players on the teams, in fact. But based off of just the coaching hires, if you had to pick one team in the XFL for next year, for 2020, that is already looking like the best team, which team would you say that would be?
Man, I don't even know the XFL teams well enough to tell you at this point. And let me do a quick Google search and see who we have here.
All right, well, we got Bob Stoops. He's the Dallas coach. June Jones, he's the Houston coach. Jim Zorn is the Seattle coach. Mark Trestman's the Tampa Bay coach. Pep Hamilton is the Washington, D.C. coach. I know the other ones are in Winston Moss is the Los Angeles coach. And then the New York coach and the St. Louis coach are the ones that I'm trying to remember off the top of my head.
I'm trying to see if I can find what the actual team names are. Do you know if they actually came up with team names yet?
They actually haven't came up with the team names yet.
Okay.
So it's kind of a slow build up. So they got the coaches, they're starting to fill in some of the other coaches on the rosters, and then we're probably going to see the players come out, and then we'll probably get the team names. But it could be not maybe the end of summer before we even get their team names.
Well, I think just based on the coaches, I would think that Dallas would have a good chance to succeed because Bob Stoops has had a very successful career in college. And out of all of these guys, I think he has one of the better resumes. The other guy that actually has a really good resume of coaching football, but not necessarily coaching in the NFL, is Mark Trestman. And you remember he was great with the Canadian Football League. He came to the Bears and the team was okay, never really lived up to expectations. But I think Bob Stoops, Mark Trestman, and Trestman, as he says, with the Tampa Bay team, have a good chance to succeed just because their coaches are very solid.
Yeah, Bob Stoops definitely a very solid college coach. Be interesting to see how his coaching aspect develops into a professional league. Remember, they did get one of the air raid offensive-minded coaches as their offensive coordinator. So I think that could be helpful for them. I'm going to go with Jim Zorn in Seattle, though. I mean, you look at that team playing in Seattle, they're going to be playing where the Seahawks play. The Seahawks, they're known for the 12th man. So if this Seattle XFL franchise can have that atmosphere at their home games, that's going to be a significant factor. And Jim Zorn, he's had some coaching experience. He's had some playing experience in the NFL for the Seahawks. I think that's going to play a big factor into the XFL, and I think that whoever's going to be on his team is going to be able to find some success in the first year of the league.
One thing I have to say about this is that it was very smart to try to pick people as coaches that are sort of regionally aligned with the team. So, like, picking Jim Zorn as the coach for the Seattle franchise was a smart move because it's somebody that they already know there. So they're not getting a random guy. They're getting somebody who is kind of like a local hero, and I think that's going to help this situation.
Yeah, I definitely do like what the XFL has done with their coaching hires, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens when we see the players assigned to teams. We should be finding that out over the next couple of months as we roll into summer. But with that said, we are getting towards the end of the show, which means we're going to be talking about fantasy football. And we got a couple of topics this week. First one, we're going to be focusing on a couple of players who were teammates for about a day, and that's Kyler Murray and Josh Rosen. So, Ryan, of these two quarterbacks, looking at the upcoming fantasy football season, which one do you think is going to have a bigger season and why?
I think it's going to be Kyler Murray, and a big reason for this is that he also brings the rushing yards and the rushing touchdowns to the mix. So if you're talking about purely performance and wins, I'm not saying that Kyler Murray is necessarily going to get you more, even though he probably will, since Josh Rosen is not on a team that's built to succeed either. But Kyler Murray can use his legs, and you can see with quarterbacks that amasses a lot of points, just because there's there's more points you get for rushing yards than there are for passing yards. So quarterbacks like even a Josh Allen, who run more than they pass, can accumulate big totals. And I think that's going to help Kyler Murray and ultimately propel him over Josh Rosen. I don't even think Josh Rosen is that great of a quarterback, in my opinion, so I don't see him having a very strong season either way.
Yeah, I know we discussed this last year when it got to the NFL draft. How we're both kind of on the opposite sides of the Josh Rosen wheel. You're more on the I really don't know about him. I can't really trust him. I'm more of I think I could see this guy being a prototypical solid quarterback in the NFL. I think it's going to be Josh Rosen. I think the reason why it's going to be Josh Rosen over Kyler Murray is because I'm not sure how Kyler Murray is going to be able to take all the big hits in the NFL. Now, obviously, he has the legs and agility to scramble and avoid a lot of these hits. But there are going to be cases where he's going to get a lot of legs, and it's going to be tough for him to avoid injury because of the bigger, stronger players in the NFL. Josh Rosen, obviously, he didn't have the best year last year, didn't have the best group of talent surrounding him. And he didn't really get much of an upgrade, if any upgrade, going to the Dolphins, talent-wise on the offensive side of the ball. But I just think that having a year experience in the NFL, I think that's going to allow him to grow a little bit and make some better decisions than he did last year. And I think it's going to be a pretty close race between these two, but I'm going to go with experience here because I'm so high on this guy, and I think that Josh Rosen's going to have the better fantasy year just because of the fact that he has experience as of right now in the NFL.
See, you say that Kyler Murray is not going to be able to stand up to the beating that an NFL season can dish out. But what about players like Russell Wilson? Russell Wilson's smart enough to avoid getting hit and getting injured. And, I mean, even players that did get injured for their first season usually held it together okay. So if you look at RG3, he had a really strong rookie season, even though he ended up being injured. So there's guys that are able to withstand at least punishment for 1 year. And I think Kyler Murray is smart enough that he's not going to always be putting himself in harm's way.
You do make a good point there, but you also have to bring into the question, how is the whole Cliff Kingsbury as the coach thing going to really work out? Because with him not having the best success in college football, if he doesn't have that success right away in the NFL, then that's obviously going to play a factor on how his team plays, and that's obviously going to play a factor on how well Kyler Murray plays. So not just the durability, but the factor of Cliff Kingsbury, I think, could be a huge factor for him as well.
That is true. That's a good point. But we don't know how either of these first-year coaches are going to go for the Dolphins or for the Cardinals. So the same argument could be made for Josh Rosen as well.
Very true. With Brian Flores, the coach in Miami, we're on both sides of this, and I think it's going to be very exciting to see which one of these guys does have the better year. But last week we had started ranking some of our top 5 players at each position group of fantasy football. We had looked at quarterbacks, and this week we're going to look at running backs. So we're going to rank our top 5 running backs. Ryan, who do you have in your top 5?
So I'll go 5-1. Number 5, I have Alvin Kamara. Without Mark Ingram in the mix, he's going to be as productive as usual, if not more productive. So the only thing is that now defenses can key in on just him a little bit more and focus on preparing for him instead of Mark Ingram. So I have him at 5. At number 4, I have a guy with a chip on his shoulder, or who should have a chip on his shoulder, Le'Veon Bell with the Jets. I think he's going to be one of the focal points of that offense, so he's going to be getting a lot of touches and a lot of usage. And I think he's going to want to prove to everyone in Pittsburgh that he was worth more money than they were willing to give him. At number 3, I have Ezekiel Elliott, who's constantly productive, doesn't really have to share the backfield with anyone on a regular basis, and is going to be getting a lot of carries with the Cowboys. Number 2, I have Saquon Barkley, coming off of a great rookie season in which he amassed a ton of yards and a ton of points. I think he's going to be one of the main guys to pick this year, one of the guys that goes first overall in some leagues most likely. And Ian, do you have any idea who I put at number 1?
See, are you thinking of someone else from the NFC South?
I am.
Let's see. I'm going to go with McCaffrey.
Christian McCaffrey, especially if you are in a PPR league, Christian McCaffrey does it all. He catches passes out of the backfield. He runs. He gets touchdowns now. And that backfield is pretty much his for the taking. And if Cam Newton isn't in a run mode this year, he's going to be seeing a ton of play out of the backfield.
Yeah, I definitely do like the guys you have on your list. I think that we saw a lot of what Christian McCaffrey was expected to do his rookie year. And I think he showed that he could be a top guy in fantasy football with the year he had. Going in my list, number 5, this guy I'm going to have as my dark horse. I think it's going to be Nick Chubb for Cleveland. We saw him come into play after the Carlos Hyde trade last year, and he put up some solid numbers for a rookie running back. He wasn't really mentioned in the Rookie of the Year race, but if he had played the full season, you could definitely make an argument that he might have been the best offensive rookie in the NFL. Obviously, tough to go with against Baker Mayfield and Saquon Barkley last year, but he definitely was out there as one of the top rookies. Number 4, I'm going to actually go with Alvin Kamara. I think that he's going to get a lot more opportunities, and yes, defenses are going to key in on him more than Mark Ingram's not there, but I still think that he's a dynamic back who's going to get a lot of opportunity now with Ingram gone. Number 3, I'm going to go with Ezekiel Elliott as well. This guy is a ground pound running back. He's going to get at least 20 to 25 rushing attempts per game. And he can also do a little bit in the receiving end. So I definitely think he's someone who's going to have a big season, especially if he is looking to get that extension coming up. Number 2, I'm going to flip your 1 and 2. I like Christian McCaffrey at number 2. And part of this is based off of the health of Cam Newton. If Cam Newton's healthy, I think that's going to help out the passing or the receiving aspect of McCaffrey's game. If he's not healthy, it's going to be a lot more run focused. And he did improve as a running back last year, running wise, getting through the holes up the middle. But I still think he has a little bit to learn. I think this year could be the year that he gets that finally learned. And then number 1, I have Saquon Barkley because this guy just dominated last year, and he played for a bad team last year. It's not like his team's going to do any better. In fact, they might do worse. But you want to know, this guy is a 3-down back, and he can do everything for that New York Giants team. I expect him to have a huge year, and don't be surprised if the top 2 guys that we're talking about both go after not only 1,000 yards rushing, but 1,000 yards receiving.
So it seems like we pretty much agree on most of our guys. I added Le'Veon Bell, and you had Nick Chubb was the only difference, and a little bit difference with the ordering.
Yeah, and the reason why I'm not so high on Le'Veon Bell is I do think he'll be a top 10 back, but the reason I'm having him outside my top 5 is because the whole year off thing, yeah, it could be really good for his body and could be huge, but he also spent a year away from the game. So it's going to take him a little bit of time to reevaluate himself into the whole NFL concept. So it might take him a little bit to get going. I mean, we've seen him get off to slow starts before he shows that he's Le'Veon Bell usual, but I think that might take a little bit longer this year for him to actually get into that old Le'Veon Bell.
Plus, I feel a little mad at Le'Veon Bell because I drafted him last year and he never even played. So, I don't know if I'd really pick him this year just because I've been burned once by him now. But I do think he's actually going to have a good season. I think he has a lot to prove. And so I think he's going to give it his best here. But he's a guy that traditionally has had sometimes injury problems, sometimes issues with effort. So if you want a more surefire guy, probably don't go his way. If you want somebody who's almost a dark horse, he's not really a true dark horse because we know what he's capable of. But if you want somebody that's a little more of a gamble, I think he would be a guy for you.
I definitely agree with you there. I don't know if he's even a first-round pick anymore based off of him not playing last year. Would you agree?
I mean, it depends. Like, if you really want a running back in the first round, and a lot of them are taken, and you're in like the later stages of the first round, I think he's probably worth a pick. He's going to be the primary running back for the Jets, and there's only so many of those in the NFL nowadays.
That's very true. And with that said, that does bring us to the end of the show. But before we do get our final thoughts, I do want to give a shout out to Chris Long. He has officially retired from the NFL. Most recently played with the Philadelphia Eagles. He has a couple of Super Bowl rings to his name. What's one thing that stood out to you about Chris Long?
I actually met Chris Long once when he was, I think it was with the Rams, I want to say. And I remember him because he was out of Virginia, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember him when I think it was his rookie season, and he was just massive. And that's the thing I remember about him most. I got his autograph at training camp. But he was a guy that, like, he seemed to always do things right. You never really heard about him doing anything wrong, doing anything to get him or his team in trouble. He was just a professional athlete at the highest level.
Yeah, I definitely agree. He was definitely a joy to watch playing, and I think he did end his career on a high note. So, as I had said, that does bring us to the end of this week's episode of Touchdown Tuesdays. What are your final thoughts for this week, Ryan?
Thanks again for continuing to support us. You can find us on Google Play, Spreaker, iTunes. If you want to stay up late, you can watch us live on YouTube. And just thank you for continuing to participate in our questions that we get out every week and continuing to listen to the episodes.
Absolutely. You said it right on right there, Ryan. Again, as I had said, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Touchdown Tuesdays. Again, we are the official football podcast of Brew Sports. Episodes available on iTunes, Google Play, and Spreaker. Check out our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter. We'll get our question of the week up there within the next day or two, so definitely keep an eye out for that. And also, if you do get a chance, check out the basketball podcast, Run It Back with Eric and Sam, as they are looking into talking about the upcoming, what the ongoing conference finals, as they're pretty big Bucks fans. You can see them wager on how stressful it is for them right now. But again, thank you for listening this week, and we look forward to bringing the world of football to you next week. Good night.